Picture a house with a swimming pool, a personal chef, and a mother who smiled for every camera in the world, and a child inside that house who was terrified to walk through the front door. For decades, Hollywood sold us flawless families. The perfect father, the devoted mother, the dazzling home life that came bundled with the movie tickets. But behind almost every one of those glowing images, a child grew up watching a very different film, one with no script, no editor, and no one yelling cut. Some of those children stayed silent their whole lives. Others didn't. They wrote memoirs. They sued estates. They stood in courtrooms and said out loud what the studios spent millions burying. This isn't a list of villains. It's a list of secrets, the ones fame almost kept forever. And the story that tops it involves a wire hanger, a best-selling memoir, and a daughter the world refused to believe until they couldn't ignore her anymore. Let's start with a case that changed everything Hollywood thought it knew about its own perfect families. She built an empire out of control, every angle, every gesture, every headline calculated for maximum devotion. Then she died, and her daughter picked up a pen and burned it all down. Christina Crawford's memoir, Mommy Dearest, didn't just accuse her famous mother of cruelty. It described a home ruled by terror, explosive punishments for imperfect wire hangers, humiliation dressed up as discipline, a public image of generosity masking a private reign of fear. The timing made it unanswerable. Joan was already gone, disinheriting Christina and her brother Christopher for reasons she claimed they already understood. To Christina, that snub was the final confirmation that the relationship had died long before her mother did. But here's where it gets messier and more human. Crawford's younger daughters, twins Kathy and Cindy, rejected almost everything Christina wrote. Friends of Joan lined up to defend her. Christopher, meanwhile, backed his sister's version completely. So which household was real? That's the uncomfortable truth this story refuses to resolve. Siblings raised under the same roof, remembering two entirely different mothers. When the book became a film, the wire hanger scene turned tragedy into something audiences almost laughed at, which only deepened the divide between the people who lived it and the people who watched it as entertainment. Crawford spent a lifetime perfecting an image nothing could crack. Her daughter proved that a child's memory doesn't need a studio's permission to survive. Which is exactly what makes our next story so unsettling, because this time, both mother and daughter got to fight back in print while they were both still alive. Most Hollywood feuds happen after death, when the accused could no longer respond. Not this one. Bette Davis was recovering from a serious illness, weakened, vulnerable, still fighting to reclaim her strength, when her daughter B.D. Hyman published My Mother's Keeper, portraying the legendary actress as domineering, self-absorbed, and corrosive to everyone around her. Davis didn't stay quiet. She fired back with her own book, This and That, accusing her daughter of cruelty, exaggeration, and turning private pain into a public weapon dressed in religious righteousness. What followed wasn't grief processed through memoir. It was open warfare, conducted in real time, in bookstores, while the world watched two women who shared a home fight over who got to define it. Hyman insisted she was finally telling the truth the public had never been allowed to see. Davis insisted she'd been betrayed by the one person she'd trusted to protect her weakest moment. The irony cuts deep. Davis had spent her career playing women who refused to be broken by betrayal, tough, unbending survivors of every plot twist thrown at them. Then real betrayal arrived from inside her own house, and no script existed to help her win. There was no tearful reconciliation, no softened final photograph for the magazines. They died holding separate versions of the same story, each one certain the other had started the war. If a public feud between two living women feels brutal, wait until you hear about the son who accused his father of violence from behind the pulpit of a best-selling confession, and split his own brothers into enemy camps over whether he was even telling the truth. The voice that defined Christmas for generations of American living rooms turned out to hide something far colder once the microphone clicked off. After Bing Crosby died, his eldest son Gary published Going My Own Way, and the title alone was a quiet accusation, a rejection of the path his father had forced on him. Gary described a childhood governed by fear, harsh discipline, controlled weight, affection that had to be earned through performance rather than given freely. It was the opposite of everything America's gentle father was supposed to represent. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. His own brothers didn't agree. Philip rejected Gary's portrait outright, calling it inaccurate. Dennis and Lindsay reportedly backed up major parts of it. For sons, one house, for different versions of the man who raised them. Was Gary exaggerating out of his own struggles with alcoholism, as critics suggested? Or had the other brothers simply been shielded from what Gary experienced directly, as the eldest, under the harshest expectations? Neither theory fully explains the split, and that's precisely why the story still unsettles people. It reveals something no tabloid headline can capture, that unequal treatment, age gaps, and individual temperament can produce completely different childhoods inside the exact same walls, without any one child having invented a single word. Crosby's warmth was so convincing it took a memoir to make the country ask whether it had ever been real at home. Speaking of manufactured warmth on screen turning into something far darker and private, our next entry involves a father who tried to block his own son's book with lawyers, and a legacy built entirely on sympathizing with children. The Little Tramp made audiences weep over a single child's tear, frame after frame, for decades. It was arguably the most effective empathy machine in cinema history. So when his own son picked up a pen, the contradiction landed like a gut punch. Charles Chaplin Jr. wrote a candid memoir about growing up inside his father's strict, perfectionist household, the same exacting standards Chaplin brought to a film set applied instead to raising children. And Chaplin didn't just dislike the book. He reportedly tried to use legal action to stop it from reaching the public at all. Think about that for a second. The man whose entire artistic identity was built on tenderness toward children attempted to silence his own son's account of what tenderness actually looked like behind closed doors. Another son, Sidney, offered a softer picture, loving his father, while still admitting the relationship had been genuinely difficult to navigate. Because Chaplin's enormous family spanned wildly different eras and marriages, his children essentially grew up knowing different men entirely. Some later described real warmth. Others never got close enough to feel it. That's what makes this case so complicated. No single memoir can cancel out another child's memory, even when they contradict each other completely. The world's most beloved on-screen father figure turned out to be nearly unreachable off-screen. And if you think a legal battle over one memoir is dramatic, wait until you hear about the family collapse that didn't just split a household, it split into two entirely separate camps of siblings, each one accusing a different parent of abuse, in a scandal that's still unresolved decades later. Some Hollywood ruptures happen slowly. This one detonated in a single moment and never stopped exploding. Woody Allen's decades-long partnership with Mia Farrow ended after it emerged he'd become involved with Soon-Yi Previn, Farrow's adopted adult daughter. Allen had never legally adopted Soon-Yi himself, but the revelation still shattered a household of 11 children, biological and adopted, virtually overnight. Then came the allegation that would define the rest of his public life. Dylan Farrow accused Allen of abusing her as a child. He was never criminally charged and has always denied it, insisting instead that Mia coached Dylan after learning about his relationship with Soon-Yi. Dylan has maintained her account into adulthood. Her brother Ronan has stood beside her, cutting ties with their father entirely. But here's the part that makes this story impossible to simplify. Not every sibling agrees. Moses Farrow rejects Dylan's allegation completely, defends Allen, and instead accuses Mia of abusing him, a claim she denies. One family, two entirely opposing versions of the truth, both defended fiercely by children who lived under the exact same roof. Every interview reopens the case. Every retrospective of Allen's earlier work now sits beside this unresolved family testimony, whether critics want it there or not. There's no tidy verdict here, just a fractured family where loyalty itself became a battlefield. And the woman at the emotional center of that fracture has her own devastating story to tell, one where her own children turned against each other over who was really protecting her. She built her identity around motherhood on a scale almost no one else in Hollywood attempted, a sprawling family of biological and adopted children, presented publicly as the one stable center of her life. Then the household that defined her fractured into something closer to civil war. After her split from Woody Allen, allegations, custody battles, and competing memories tore the family into opposing camps that have never fully reconciled. Moses Farrow, once closely aligned with his mother, became estranged as an adult and published a detailed essay accusing her of physical and emotional mistreatment. Soon-Yi Previn separately described Mia as controlling and abusive. Farrow has denied every accusation, and several of her other children have publicly defended her, insisting Moses and Soon-Yi's accounts don't reflect the childhood they remember. Dylan and Ronan remain firmly in her corner. This is the part that should stop you cold. This isn't a story where every child eventually turned against one parent. It's a family whose members remember the exact same house completely differently, some describing safety, others describing fear, with no outside observer able to reconcile the two. Moses's decision to break from the narrative he'd once publicly supported shocked people precisely because he'd been considered one of Mia's staunchest allies. Every fresh interview reopens old wounds instead of closing them. Fame didn't just expose this conflict, it handed every wound a permanent audience, making peace almost mathematically impossible. If you think a split family is devastating, our next story involves an actor whose own sons couldn't even agree on who had failed whom, right up until the moment they had to decide who got to bury him. No performer reshaped the art of acting more completely, and few performers presided over a more shattered family. Brando fathered numerous children across multiple marriages and relationships, and their lives unfolded amid custody battles, long absences, addiction, and secrecy so dense that outsiders still can't map the whole family tree. Then came the tragedy that made headlines worldwide. Christian Brando's relationship with his father had already deteriorated through a turbulent youth, but everything collapsed completely when Christian killed Dag Drolet, the boyfriend of his half-sister Cheyenne, inside Marlon's own home. Christian served prison time. Cheyenne's life spiraled into an even darker decline afterward, ending in tragedy before she could find peace. Brando tried to support and defend his children through the fallout, but no courtroom speech could undo years of instability that had built up long before that fatal night. Some of his children later protected his legacy, participating in projects that honored his work. Others withdrew entirely, choosing distance over defense. That split alone tells you everything. There's no single, easy verdict here. Brando could summon devastating vulnerability in any character he played. His own family revealed the vulnerabilities he can never master in real life. With a family this large, no two children experienced the same father. Some got his full attention, some got almost none, and all of them lived beneath a reputation too enormous for ordinary grievances to ever feel ordinary. Our next case swaps courtroom tragedy for a scandal even darker, a murder trial, and a daughter who chose not to call her own father Dad ever again. There's a particular kind of pain in a daughter who calls her father by his first name instead of Dad. That single detail tells you almost the entire story. Rose Lenore was still a baby when her mother, Bonnie Lee Backley, was shot to death outside a restaurant. Robert Blake was charged in the killing, later acquitted in criminal court, though a civil jury still found him liable for her death. Rose never lived with him again, raised instead by relatives, and for roughly 14 years, father and daughter had zero relationship while the country argued endlessly over his guilt. As a young adult, she finally reached out. They met. Contact continued in a limited, unusual way for the rest of his life. But Rose refused to hand the story the ending everyone wanted. She wouldn't publicly declare whether she believed he was responsible, explaining that living permanently inside that question would make her own life unbearable. That refusal was its own quiet rebellion. She wouldn't become his defender. She wouldn't become his prosecutor. She wouldn't carry his scandal as her identity. Blake spent years insisting on his innocence to anyone who'd listen. His daughter built her peace by declining to let his version, or the public's version, dictate her future at all. Sometimes the most powerful thing a child can do isn't accuse or forgive. It's simply refuse to play the role a scandal assigns them. That kind of quiet defiance is nothing compared to what happened when a teenage girl actually killed the man threatening her glamorous mother's life. And somehow, that wasn't even the most shocking part of the story. One of Hollywood's most glittering homes became the backdrop for a scandal so violent it followed Cheryl Crane for the rest of her life. As a teenager, Cheryl fatally stabbed her mother Lana Turner's boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato, during a violent confrontation inside the house. Authorities ruled it justifiable homicide, but justifiable doesn't erase what a child witnesses in that kind of moment or what comes after. What followed wasn't a clean resolution. It was years of pain, institutions, emotional distance, and dueling memories that neither mother nor daughter could fully agree on. Cheryl eventually published a memoir describing a childhood shaped by fame, unstable relationships, and long stretches without her mother present. Turner reportedly found parts of the public account genuinely painful, and their relationship moved through tense, difficult periods as a result. But this story doesn't end in permanent estrangement, and that's what makes it different from so many others on this list. Mother and daughter eventually reconciled and stayed connected for the rest of Turner's life. Cheryl wasn't trying to destroy a glamorous mother's reputation. She was trying to explain how a child gets trapped inside adult chaos she never chose and couldn't control. The studio machine sold Turner as untouchable glamour, wrapped in satin and studio lighting. Her daughter's account revealed the frightened, chaotic family hiding underneath it. Love did survive here, but only after the silence broke first, and the perfect picture was finally allowed to crack. Speaking of children exposed to violence they never should have witnessed, our next entry follows a romantic leading man whose own son accused him of the exact opposite of everything his movies promised. Audiences fell in love with him as the ultimate romantic lead, charm that could fill a movie screen and make an entire generation believe in love at first sight. His children described something entirely different behind closed doors. Griffin O'Neill publicly accused his father of violence, neglect, drug use, and years of accumulated emotional damage. Tatum O'Neill, in her own writing, said she'd been exposed to dangerous adult situations while still just a child, describing a father who could turn jealous, controlling, and abusive without warning. Ryan disputed several of these accusations, offering his own painful account of a family overwhelmed by addiction, divorce, and repeated tragedy. And there was plenty of tragedy layered underneath: the death of Griffin's brother, the long illness and eventual death of Ryan's longtime partner Farrah Fawcett, and Redmond O'Neill's own repeated struggles with the law and substance abuse. This wasn't one clean rupture. It was a family caught in cycles of reunion, argument, and renewed estrangement that never fully stopped repeating. Tatum and Ryan did attempt public reconciliation at points, but trust never fully returned. Griffin remained especially bitter, insisting the damage had reached across generations of the family. The real tragedy wasn't an absence of love, it was love constantly tangled up with fear, competition, and blame, impossible to separate from one another. In Love Story, moviegoers watched him lose the person he loved most. In real life, he spent decades losing and briefly recovering his own children over and over, in smaller and much less cinematic ways. Their memoirs guaranteed his romantic image would forever face cross-examination from inside his own family. Our next story swaps volatile chaos for something colder, a will that didn't just leave children out of an inheritance, it left them out of existing at all. The public saw a man who dedicated himself to helpless children through decades of charity telethons, practically building his public identity around compassion for the vulnerable. Several of his own sons described something almost unrecognizable in private. His eldest son, Gary Lewis, said his father had been harsh, frightening, and emotionally cruel throughout their childhood. Other sons described a painful distance that only widened after Jerry left their mother Patty to begin a new family entirely. Then came the final, unmistakable message. Jerry's will explicitly excluded all 6 sons from his first marriage and their descendants, leaving the bulk of his estate to his second wife and naming their daughter as the next beneficiary. One son, Joseph, had already died before Jerry after years of addiction and estrangement from a family. Jerry later expressed regret about not doing more to help him. But regret arriving after death doesn't erase the pattern the surviving brothers had already lived through. Defenders point to his genuinely enormous charitable impact and argue that family stories get complicated after bitter divorces, and both things can be true simultaneously. A person can help millions of strangers and still fail the children sitting at his own dinner table. The Sun's interviews flipped the king of comedy narrative upside down. A man who spent decades begging audiences to care about vulnerable kids had, according to his own children, left them feeling completely unseen. The disinheritance made that emotional distance official, converting decades of quiet rejection into one final, unambiguous legal sentence. If financial exclusion feels brutal, wait until you hear about the actor who denied his own daughter's existence for years, only acknowledging her once in silence, without ever saying her name. For decades, one woman lived inside a secret constructed specifically to protect 2 glittering careers. Judy Lewis's mother, Loretta Young, publicly presented her as adopted. Clark Gable, meanwhile, never once acknowledged Judy as his daughter, not privately, and certainly not to the world that crowned him the king of Hollywood. Judy grew up noticing an uncanny resemblance in the mirror, hearing whispered rumors she couldn't fully understand, and watching adults react strangely to her face without ever explaining why. She later said Gable visited her exactly once, when she was a teenager. He reportedly spoke warmly during that single meeting, but he never explained who he actually was, never claimed her publicly, and never returned to build any kind of relationship afterward. One visit, a lifetime of silence surrounding it. When Judy finally learned the full truth, it reshaped how she understood her entire childhood retroactively. Her eventual memoir became an act of defiance against both parents and against a studio system that had treated her very identity as a piece of dangerous information requiring permanent containment. She never accused Gable through wild rumor or speculation. She simply described the specific wound of being silently recognized as his child, while publicly denied that recognition for her entire life. Gable died before Judy ever got the chance to confront him as an adult. Her later decision to finally name him publicly became the very conversation he had spent his whole life avoiding, the acknowledgement he never gave her while he still could. His King of Hollywood image never fully recovered from one brutal question: what kind of king can't say his own child's name out loud? The woman who kept that secret alive has an even more devastating story of her own.